She was found lying on the floor with 20 stab wounds, including 10 to the back of her neck and head, and a 10-inch serrated kitchen knife stuck in her chest. Yet this brutal, impossible scene was officially listed as death by suicide. What psychological forces are at play when the official narrative so aggressively defies forensic reality in this 20-stab mystery? Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I don't just talk about the crimes. I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. We look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. Subscribe and like this video if you want to learn more about the mental health and psychological indicators of true crime cases like this one. Today we're examining a truly baffling case that forces us to look past the surface of a tragedy and into unsettling dynamics of human behavior. This is the case of Ellen Greenberg. This case involves a controversial manner of death, which briefly discusses death by suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we proceed, it's crucial to state that the individual who discovered Ellen, Sam, has not been charged or convicted of any crime related to her death. Therefore, my analysis focused strictly on the reported behaviors, statements, and circumstantial evidence in the public record. This is my professional speculation and exploration of the psychological and mental health indicators, not a formal diagnosis of any individual. The first psychological red flag here is an emotional and cognitive disassociation from reality. This indicator centers on the immediate contradictory statement made during a high-stress 911 call. This initial confusing narrative stands in stark contrast to the reality discovered at the scene. This is the first behavioral clue here, suggesting a disconnect between external reality and the internal emotional or cognitive state. An instantaneous and wildly inaccurate explanation for a horrific event can be a psychological defense mechanism or a premeditated cover story. In moments of genuine, profound shock, people often react with panic silence or basic facts. They rarely offer a definitive, complex yet contradictory explanation of the cause of death. On January 26, 2011, Ellen Greenberg, a 27-year-old first-grade teacher, was found dead in the kitchen of her Philadelphia apartment by Sam, her fiancé. Sam had returned from the gym to find the door locked from the inside with the swing bar latched. After forcing the door open, he called 911. During the frantic call, Sam initially told the operator he found Ellen on the floor covered in blood. However, while being instructed to perform CPR, he cried out, "Oh my God, she stabbed herself." And then, "She fell on a knife. I don't know. Her knife is sticking out. There's a knife sticking out of her heart." The reality was horrifying. Ellen had suffered 20 stab wounds, including 10 to the back of her head and neck. To jump to the conclusion of she stabbed herself or fell on a knife so quickly and with such certainty, despite the sheer number of placement of wounds, is a significant psychological anomaly that demands my analysis. It's an immediate framing of the narrative that does not fit the visual evidence. The second psychological red flag here is the calculated deception and attempt to validate the narrative. When a story contains an unnecessary, verifiable falsehood, the psychological integrity of the entire narrative comes into question. The introduction of an external third-party witness, especially one tied to the authority of the building, this points toward a calculated effort to manipulate the immediate environment and investigation, a trait often associated with individuals who employ narcissistic or antisocial personality patterns, namely a willingness to deceive others to control an outcome. The false inclusion of a witness appears designed to preemptively encounter suspicion and add credibility to the story of the forced entry. Ellen's fiancé, Sam, initially told police that when he broke down the door, a security guard was present and witnessed the forced entry. Police reportedly relayed this information to the medical examiner as a piece of evidence supporting the suicide narrative, as a witness verified the broken lock. However, a later disposition revealed the security guard said he was not there when Sam forced the door open and never entered the apartment. More interesting, security camera footage showed Sam without the security guard on the elevator just before the 911 call was placed. This detail is crucial. Why invent a witness who could so easily be disproved? This raises a profound psychological curiosity gap. Was the lie an act of panic? Or was it a deliberate attempt to plant a seed of external validation for the break-in story before realizing security footage might contradict it? The third psychological red flag here is controlling behavior and compromising the chain of custody. The swift and unusual removal of key evidence by a family member of the deceased's partner is a highly unusual psychological move that speaks volumes about controlling impulses. An individual driven by a need for control may act preemptively to remove anything that could lead to an unpredictable or damaging outcome. This impulse suggests a deep-seated fear of exposure or loss of control over the emerging facts of the case. While Sam did not personally remove the items, his close family members' actions within hours of the discovery compromised the integrity of the scene. The morning after Ellen's death, before detectives had fully investigated or seized the items, Sam's uncle removed Ellen's iPhone and 2 computers from the apartment. This action broke the essential chain of custody for crucial electronic evidence. In any death investigation, digital devices are often a window into the victim's and the partner's final psychological states, potential disputes, and recent activities. The voluntary, immediate, and unauthorized removal of these items is psychologically striking here. It suggests a priority that was not the pursuit of the truth, but the control of the information. This also creates a significant curiosity gap around the information that might have been contained on those devices. What was on those devices? Was it something that Sam did not want the authorities to know or find out? We may never know. The fourth psychological red flag here is an extreme force and lack of defensive wounds and victimology. We must turn to the physical evidence not to describe the wounds, but to explore the psychology of the victim and the alleged perpetrator. The medical evidence introduces a critical psychological puzzle. An individual attempting to die by suicide typically seeks a quick, effective, and less painful method, not a prolonged, excruciating assault. The 20 stab wounds, 10 to the back of the head and neck, and 10 to the chest and abdomen, suggest an overwhelming frenzy, an extraordinary degree of violence. Experts noted a lack of defensive wounds on Ellen's hands, which is a near universal sign of fighting off an attack. If a person was being attacked, the psychological impulse is to protect oneself. If they are committing the act themselves, the injuries usually focus on highly accessible areas like the chest, neck, or wrist, not the back of the head. The initial medical examiner, Dr. Marlin, actually ruled Ellen's death as homicide due to the sheer number of unique distribution of the stab wounds. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence later revealed in dispositions was a deep stab wound to the neck that penetrated the spinal cord. Experts testified that this injury would have been immediately incapacitating or fatal, making it physically impossible for Ellen to have inflicted the subsequent wounds. The psychological angle here is pivotal. If the perpetrator intended to silence or incapacitate the victim quickly, an overwhelming, brutal attack that ensures swift debilitation fits a different psychological profile than a chaotic struggle. This points towards a perpetrator who may have exhibited psychopathic or antisocial traits, prioritizing their objective over the victim's suffering, and possibly having an impaired capacity for empathy. The fact that her manner of death was later controversially changed to suicide after a meeting with police despite the forensic evidence further fuels the psychological mystery of why an unnatural narrative was being pursued. The fifth psychological red flag is misappropriation of mental health as a post hoc justification. The narrative surrounding Ellen's mental health shifts dramatically after her death, a psychological manipulation designed to support a suicide ruling. A common psychological tactic in covering up a crime is to leverage any existing mental health struggles of the victim to justify a conclusion of suicide. This deflects attention from the perpetrator and places the burden of explanation onto the victim's internal state. This is an act of betrayal and psychological scapegoating. Before her death, Ellen had been seeing a psychiatrist for anxiety. Just because you have anxiety doesn't mean you're also suicidal. She had 3 sessions and was prescribed anxiety medication. She had no history of suicide attempts, no diagnosed depression, and no recorded suicidal ideation. Friends noted that she had become nervous and differential in the months leading up to her death, a subtle psychological shift that can sometimes indicate a person is in an emotional controlling or toxic relationship, or under extreme stress. Sam later released a public statement insisting, "When Ellen took her own life, it left me bewildered." He painted a picture of a wonderful person who had everything to live for. The psychological tension lies in the contrast. Ellen's family and friends speak of a kind, vibrant woman whose primary struggle was manageable anxiety, while the official ruling uses this anxiety as a pillar to explain a physically impossible and extremely violent act. This forced narrative, utilizing a private mental health struggle to close a major case, is a powerful psychological tool used for deception. The psychological and mental health analysis of an uncharged individual must be cautious, yet the behavioral evidence presents a pattern. Based purely on the documented behaviors, inconsistencies, and attempts to control the evidence and narrative, there are certain traits here associated with what's called the dark triad. Narcissism, Machiavellism, and psychopathy are potentially relevant to the behavioral clues that we've discussed. Narcissistic personality traits or psychopathic traits is a grandiose sense of entitlement, the assumption that one can fabricate a witness or remove evidence without consequence is an inflated sense of one's own power and immunity. The lack of empathy or remorse and the ability to immediately frame the death as a suicide, despite the horror of the scene, and then publicly defend that narrative for years, suggesting a profound lack of emotional connection to the victim or remorse for the loss. And then there are behaviors of pathological lying and deception. The invention of the security guard witness is a clear example of calculated deception aimed at controlling the initial police reaction. The motivation behind such psychological maneuvers, if one were to assume a cover-up, is typically rooted in avoiding accountability and preserving one's reputation and life, a strong self-preservation instinct often found in individuals with antisocial or narcissistic patterns of behavior. The why would be a desperate attempt to restore psychological equilibrium after a catastrophic event, shifting the burden of explanation entirely onto the victim's internal struggle, ensuring that the source of the catastrophe is never traced back. Bringing the case full circle, the psychological pieces of this puzzle fit together not as a random events, but as a potential sequence of evidence control and narrative manipulation. The story of the locked door, the cornerstone of the suicide ruling, is contradicted by the false claim of the security guard witness, which in turn suggests the forced entry itself may be a psychological performance to establish the no intruder context. The initial immediate declaration of "she stabbed herself" on the 911 call preframes the suicide, preempting any questioning of how a third party could have entered and left. Finally, the swift removal of digital evidence seals the psychological and physical crime scene, eliminating the most direct window into the victim's final days and any potential conflict. The aha moment comes when we realize the significance of the missing witness. If the security guard wasn't there to corroborate the broken lock, and the lock was the primary reason police initially treated it as suicide, then the entire foundation of the original ruling is psychologically compromised. It forces us to ask, what happens when the most crucial piece of evidence, the perfectly locked door, is upheld by a claim that was proven false by surveillance and witness deposition? It's a classic red herring, psychologically designed to mislead investigators while the clock was ticking. The lingering question that haunts this case is why an entire system seemed to be willing to accept a physically improbable scenario, a woman stabbing herself 20 times, 10 in the back of her head with no defensive wounds, when the behavioral, circumstantial, and forensic clues, once analyzed through a psychological lens, point to something entirely different. The true tragedy is not just the death, but the psychological aftermath where a victim's existing mental health condition is weaponized to justify the impossible. The pursuit of the truth in this case continues, driven by a family and a legal team who refuse to accept a narrative that defies both forensic science and common sense psychology. The complexities of human behavior, deception, and the struggle for control are all laid bare in this single perplexing death in a Philadelphia apartment. What did you think about this case? Do you think Ellen died by suicide with all those stab wounds? Or do you think it might have been Sam or somebody completely different that we are not aware yet? Remember, I am not placing blame on Sam or anyone in this case. These are behaviors that are really intriguing. It makes me wonder, are there something else going on here? If you like this mental health analysis of this true crime case, please subscribe and join me for more. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.